His fingers were numb on the radio key, not from the Italian night, but from counting seconds. The shelling was due any minute. Somewhere up on that ridge sat a company of Americans who did not want him at their table. And somewhere behind barbed wire in California sat the people who had given him his name. The German dispatch on his lap, still damp, still smelling faintly of river water, was the only reason he knew the guns were about to turn. Static clawed at his ears. The field set wheezed like an old man. He pressed the key again, careful, precise, sending the coordinates in clipped English, then in German phrasing the staff would recognize. No answer. Rain ticked on the canvas over his head. A lantern swung, throwing his shadow over the map. If they believed him, those men would pull back 20, 30 yards. Enough to live through the barrage. If they didn't, they would die thinking no one had warned them. The thought that it might be him, the Jap interpreter, who saved them, sat on his tongue like iron. "Come on," he whispered to the crackling dark. "Take the message." 72. Hours earlier, near Anzio, Italian front, March 1944. Mud had a way of making every man look the same. Faces streaked, trousers caked, helmets dulled by rain, rank blurred when everybody was wet and cold. Kenji Tanaka slogged after the runner toward the operations tent, boots sucking at the ground, the cold working up through his soles. The tent was a yellow glow in a landscape of gray olive drab and bare trees. Inside, warmth hit him with the smell of wet wool, tobacco, and map varnish. A captain bent over a field map glanced up. His eyes flicked, just a fraction, over the slant of Ken's face before he covered it with briskness. "You the interpreter, miss?" "Yes, sir." "Good. We picked this off a courier we shot out of a motorcycle. Soak through. See what you can make of it." The captain handed him the limp bundle of German handwriting. Ken took it carefully, as if it were an injured bird. The paper was thin, wartime stuff, corners fraying. Ink had bled where water got in, turning neat Gothic letters into bruises. He sat at the folding table, pushed aside someone's cold coffee, and leaned under the lantern. Outside, rain pattered harder on canvas. Voices rose and fell. Logistics, ammunition, rations. Men did important, visible things. He did the thing no one saw. The header was easy enough. Dated 2 days prior, a forward observer report. He followed the slant of the scrawl, filling in a missing stroke here, an umlaut there. Stellung der amerikanischen Infantry. American infantry position. His pencil moved on his notebook, English in tight block letters. He read it twice to be sure. The coordinates described a sector not far from here. Not his battalion, but close, too close. Bootsteps scuffed behind him. "How long's that going to take, Tanaka?" A voice said. "Casual. Infantry lieutenant. Mess kit still on his belt." "As long as it takes to keep your head down at the right time, Lieutenant," Ken said without looking up. He kept his tone even, respectful, not servile. Better to let the work speak. The lieutenant gave a short snort. "Long as it's not sending our positions to Tokyo." There was a beat, a small silence. Ken felt the captain's eyes shift, felt the heat crawl up his neck. He kept translating. The words on the page were his anchor. The letters did not care what color his skin was. Rain, artillery, insults. None of them changed the grammar of German reconnaissance. He underlined a phrase. Bereitstellung für Artillerieschlag. Preparation for artillery strike. Time window, afternoon, weather permitting. He looked up. "Sir, this mentions an artillery preparation on an American sector. Time frame is tomorrow afternoon." The captain stepped closer, all business now. "You sure?" Yes, sir. The sector is... He tapped the map with his pencil, comparing the German grid to the American overlay. Here, they describe the stream bend and the ruined farmhouse. That matches our map. That's Able Company of the 141st, the captain muttered. They're pushing north tomorrow. The lieutenant shifted, some of the mockery drying from his face. You're sure? He said again. But the edge was different. Need, not scorn. Ken met his eyes for the first time. The German adjutant who wrote this was thorough. If weather improves, they fire. The captain straightened. All right, I'll pass it up. Good work. Good work. 2 clipped words, no smile. But in a wet Italian tent, that was as much laurel as anybody got. Ken nodded, eyes dropping back to the dispatch. He made a second copy of the crucial lines, dating and signing with his initials the way MIS had trained him. Documentation was armor. Paper was proof. Outside, a truck backfired. Someone cursed. The war went on, loud and indifferent. He thought briefly of his mother's letter folded in his pack, of the black bars over her handwriting, of the barbed wire sketched by his sister in the corner. He was here, serving, precisely so those bars would someday be gone. Yet here, even here, he had to translate himself before he could translate the enemy. He blew gently on the page to dry the ink. If they listened to this soggy piece of German, men tomorrow would live. If they didn't, they would die, never knowing the warning came from a Nisei in a muddy tent in Italy. That was the shape of his war. The mail sack arrived on the back of a mud-spattered jeep, tossed down like it carried nothing more than socks. Men drifted toward it the way thirsty men drift toward water. Names were called out over the patter of rain, the clerk's voice flat, unromantic. Letters from Ohio, from Brooklyn, from Kansas farms. Every shout of, "Hey, over here," made the Yelf's bivouac sound for a moment, like America. Tanaka, the clerk said, stumbling a little over the second syllable. Ken lifted his hand. The envelope was thin, cream turned gray by travel, corners gone soft. Return address, the camp. The postmark lagged weeks behind the current date. He turned it over once in his hand, aware of eyes on him. Someone a few yards away muttered, not unkindly, "Got one from home, huh?" Home. He slipped the letter into his breast pocket. Reading it out in the open, under other men's curiosity, would make him a spectacle. Better to wait for a corner, a lull. Better to let the mud on his boots dry and his pulse slow. Finding privacy in a war was like looking for dry socks in a downpour. The tents were full, every crate a seat, every log claimed. He carried his notebook and the letter toward the medical truck, then veered off when he saw the medic stitching a man's palm. He tried the lee side of the supply stack. 2 cooks were smoking there. Finally, he picked the narrow space between his own tent and a hedgerow, where the canvas flapped and the earth smelled of wet leaves. It was barely enough room to crouch. He broke the seal carefully, as if haste might tear out what the sensors had already taken. The paper crackled in the damp air. His mother's handwriting ran neat across the page, hiragana rounded, English phrases tucked in when she could not find the kanji. Black bars slashed through sentences. Thick strokes of government ink. He could tell which lines had been cheerful, because they were the ones the censor had cut. "Dearest Kenji," it began, "we receive your letters and we are," a black line long, "that you are safe. Your father's," black again, "has been moved to help in the tool shop. Your sister studies English every evening so that when the war is over," another bar, "not be behind." He read each cutout as an injury, not because the words were precious, but because they proved somebody, somewhere in America, did not trust what a mother said to her son fighting in Italy. Rain tapped his helmet. He huddled closer to the canvas, shielding the ink. There was a description of the camp church service, permitted. A mention of the dust in summer, permitted. A question, is Italy beautiful? Permitted. Then, near the bottom, in smaller writing, as if she had bent close to the paper, we are proud of you. That line, for some reason, had been allowed. His throat tightened. Proud of him. Proud of him while fenced in. He saw suddenly the contrast. Him in damp olive drab, boots in European mud, translating German for officers who sometimes forgot to look him in the eye. And her, in a barracks that smelled of too many people and government disinfectant, writing pride across a page she knew strangers would read first. He folded the letter on his knee, not to put it away, but to stop himself from crumpling it. Regulation, especially for people around intelligence, advised against keeping personal correspondence too long in forward areas. Loose papers got lost, captured, read. He should burn it after committing dates and names to memory. A gust rippled the tent wall. Voices carried from up the line. Someone joked about sausage. The war was close and yet far. He looked at the letter again. Burning it would be clean, professional. A man who had chosen service over self would burn it. He slid it back into the envelope instead. That was the irreversible part. Not the act of keeping paper, but the admission that he needed the weight of that envelope more than he needed to be perfect. He needed to remember that someone on the wrong side of American barbed wire still believed he belonged. Footsteps squelched nearby. Tanaka, Ops wants you. Pete Howe's brought in. He straightened, tucking the envelope deep into his tunic, behind his notebook. Coming. The runner didn't wait. Men rarely waited for interpreters. Interpreters were supposed to keep up. Ken took a breath, smoothed his helmet strap, and stepped back into the open where other eyes could see him. The sky was low, pewter-colored. Trucks idled, coughing exhaust. 2 German prisoners, mud to their knees and hands bound, were being marched toward a tent by a pair of MPs. Their field gray looked almost the same shade as the Italian day. As he walked, he felt the letter against his chest. A thin, papery reminder of everything that was wrong and yet worth enduring. It hurt, but it also steadied him. If his mother could write, "We are proud," on government paper in a camp, he could translate for officers who doubted him. At the tent flap, the captain from earlier looked up. Good. We've got a Feldwebel who doesn't like English. See what you can shake out of him. Yes, sir. He nodded once, letting the professional mask settle over him again. Japanese-American, MS Forward Unit. The man who kept it all straight. No one needed to know about the envelope hidden in his tunic or the bars of black ink across a mother's words. No one would know, and he would do the job anyway. The interrogation tent was warmer than the outside air, but it wasn't a friendly warmth. It was the warmth of too many bodies and a lantern turned up high, the cloth walls holding in breath and tobacco and wet wool. 2 MPs stood just inside the flap, carbines slung, boots muddy. Between them, on a folding chair, sat the German. Feldwebel by the look of the shoulder straps, non-commissioned, seasoned. His field gray was smeared with the same Italian mud as theirs, but he had managed to keep his spine straight. His cap had been taken, pale hair was plastered to his head. He had the guarded eyes of a man who knew that information could buy time. The captain from operations gestured with his chin. That him? Yes, sir. Make it quick. We've got patrols going out at dusk. We need to know if their guns are still sighted on that valley. The captain's tone wasn't hostile, just tired. But there was a second lieutenant beside him, the same one who had joked earlier, and that man's eyes were openly curious, weighing Ken, wondering if this would be the moment the interpreter fell short. Ken set his notebook on the table, pencil ready. He let himself take one breath, in through the nose, slow. The letter in his tunic was a flattened shape against his chest, proof of a life beyond this canvas cave. He kept his face still. The German eyed him. When he spoke, it was in halting English. "I am prisoner of war. I will go to camp. I have to say only name, rank, number." Ken replied in English first, because the Americans needed to hear him in their language, to be reminded he was on their side. "Yes, you are a prisoner of war. You will be treated according to the conventions. But artillery dispositions are not protected information in this theater. Not when your guns are firing on us." He saw the faint flicker in the German's eyes, recognition that this prisoner of war knew the rules. "Good." The German shook his head. "Name, rank, number." The captain exhaled sharply. The lieutenant crossed his arms. One of the MPs shifted his weight. Ken looked down at the paper he'd been given earlier, German handwriting from the courier. He tapped it lightly for effect. Then he looked up and, without warning, slid into German. "Sie haben gestern Meldung gemacht über amerikanische Stellungen am Flussbogen," he said. "You reported yesterday on American positions at the river bend. Ihr Beobachtungsposten ist also noch besetzt, ja? So your observation post is still manned, yes?" The Feldwebel blinked. It wasn't just the German. It was the cadence, a Rhineland softness he'd picked up from an instructor. Not perfect, but close enough to throw a man captured the day before. The German's mouth opened a fraction. He studied Ken as if seeing him for the first time. Then suspicion came back in. "Woher sprechen Sie so?" "Where do you speak like that from?" Ken didn't answer that. Instead he pressed, "Die Batterie, die gestern geschossen hat. War das 10,5 cm oder 15 cm?" "The battery that fired yesterday, 10.5 cm or 15 cm?" The captain's attention sharpened. The lieutenant leaned forward. They didn't understand every word, but they heard the question, artillery caliber. The Feldwebel's jaw worked. "Ich muss nichts sagen," he muttered. Ken let silence fall. Silence was a tool, too, the kind he'd learned in training. He let the German hear the rain on the canvas, the distant thump of an American truck, the paper scratch of his pencil ready. Let him think about being the only German in a tent full of Americans in a foreign country where the front was slowly moving northward and his side was losing ground. He spoke more quietly. "Ihre Leute gehen sowieso zurück," he said. "Your people are falling back anyway. Wenn wir wissen, welche Batterien hier bleiben, können wir die Verwundeten schneller holen. Das ist auch für Ihre Männer besser. If we know which batteries stay, we can get the wounded out faster. That's better for your men also." That part was not entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false. The line between the two was where interrogations lived. The Feldwebel hesitated. His eyes slid to the side, to the Americans, as if to check whether they understood. He found no help there. He was alone in the language with the Japanese-faced American, and in that isolation, things loosened. 10,5, he said at last. Aber 2 Geschütze wurden gestern verlegt. 2 guns were moved yesterday. Ken wrote, 10,5 centimeter, 2 guns moved. Wohin? Where? Auf die Anhöhe südlich. He gave a landmark, a low rise south of their current map line near a ruined farmhouse. The same farmhouse mentioned in the Soak dispatch. That was confirmation. Aber der Beobachtungsposten bleibt da oben. Observation post stays up top. How many men in the OP? Ken asked in German. 3. 3. Good. Small. easier for the Americans to dislodge. Behind him, the lieutenant shifted again, impatient. "You getting anything, Tanaka?" he said, as if maybe all this German was for show. Ken didn't look up. "Yes, sir. 10.5s, not 15s. 2 pieces moved to the southern rise. OP still on the ridge, 3 men. Same area as that dispatch we translated." The captain grunted approval. "That'll help. Keep going." Ken turned back to the German. "Wann feuern Sie wieder?" "When do they fire again?" The Feldwebel pressed his lips together. Ken changed tack. "Sie wissen, dass Sie weiter nach Süden transportiert werden," he said. "You know you'll be transported further south. Wenn die Amerikaner wissen, wann geschossen wird, geraten Sie nicht ins Kreuzfeuer. If the Americans know when they fire, you won't be caught in the crossfire." Another small crack. The Feldwebel exhaled. "Morgen früh. Wenn Wetter. Tomorrow morning, if weather. Wir haben auch Munitionsmangel." "We are low on ammunition." Ken noted that. The captain would like to hear it. He sat back a little, letting the Germans see that the worst of it was over. He didn't gloat. Interrogations were not victories to celebrate, they were tasks to complete. He looked to the captain. "That's the gist, sir. Light artillery, morning, weather permitting. 2 guns shifted to that southern rise. OP still watching our valley." The captain nodded once. "Outstanding." The word hit Ken like a hand on the shoulder he didn't receive. He settled for the sound. Outstanding. He'd take it. The lieutenant didn't quite know what to do with his earlier joke now. His mouth worked, then closed. "You speak it good," he said finally, awkward. "Enough to keep us out of their guns, Lieutenant," Ken said, tone neutral. The MPs led the Feldwebel out. The German looked back once at Ken, brows drawn, as if trying to fit him into a category. Enemy? Native? Interrogator? It didn't resolve. It never did. When the tent flap fell back into place, some of the tension bled from Ken's shoulders. He realized his fingers had gone tight around the pencil. His knuckles were pale. He flexed them. This was the irreversible part. He'd shown them he could pull artillery schedules out of a Feldwebel in 10 minutes. That meant every time a POW came in, every time a soggy piece of paper surfaced, they'd call him. He would be indispensable, and therefore always visible. A Nisei the unit could not ignore. He gathered his notes, dated them, and wrote his initials. Paper as armor, again. When someone higher up asked, "How did we know about the morning barrage?" there would be a line in his handwriting. Outside, the rain had slowed to a mist. Trucks still idled. The smell of coffee substitute drifted over from the mess. He breathed it in, let the damp air cool his face. Quiet fortitude, he thought. Not as words, but as a sensation. Doing the work under watchful eyes, in a borrowed language, for men who might never say thank you. He stepped out into the gray to bring the captain his report. Evening in the bivouac was never really evening, just a wetter, darker version of the same day. The rain had eased to a hanging mist that beaded on canvas and helmets. Lanterns in the mess tent made pale rectangles against the murk. Men drifted toward them in 2s and 3s, drawn by heat and whatever the cooks had managed to make out of tins and powder. Ken fell in with the flow, notes from the interrogation folded in his pocket. The POW's artillery schedule already passed to the captain. The work portion of the day was done. Now came the part that should have been easy, sitting, eating, being one of them. Inside, the mess tent was a low-ceilinged cave of steam, breath, and metal clatter. Benches were close, elbows closer. Someone laughed at a story from the road up from Naples. A radio in the corner hissed with music that faded in and out, an American sound distorted by distance. It smelled of coffee substitute, of boiled meat, of wet wool starting to dry. He took a tray and moved down the line. Ladle of thick, gray-brown stew. Slice of bread that had seen better days. He murmured thanks to the cook and got a nod. So far, so ordinary. He spotted an open stretch on a bench, not big, but enough. He slid in, careful not to bump the man on his left. Conversations around him dipped for a second, the way they do when someone not quite in the group sits down, then rose again. He kept his eyes on his tray, shoulders squared but not stiff. If you acted like you belonged, sometimes a body believed. You. Opposite him, the infantry lieutenant sat down with his own tray, tin cup in hand. Same man, the one from the interrogation tent, from the earlier joke. His hair was damp, his jaw shadowed by a day's growth. He looked at Ken for a second over the edge of the cup and smirked, as if picking up a thread of conversation no one else had heard. "Well, if we get shelled in the morning," the lieutenant said loud enough for the men nearby to catch it, "we'll know who radioed the wrong side." A couple of heads turned. Not everyone caught the words, but tone traveled. Jokes in a mess tent had weight. They set hierarchies. Ken's spoon paused above his tray. For a heartbeat, the old answers crowded his throat. Sharp, hot American answers. The letter in his pocket felt like a square of ice against his chest. His parents in a camp. Him here. And this man, warm and fed, questioning which side he was on. He set the spoon down. Across from him, the lieutenant was smiling like it was nothing. A little needle to pass the time. Maybe he didn't even know how close he was to the bone. Ken kept his voice even. "If I were sending to Tokyo, Lieutenant," he said, "I wouldn't have told the captain about the 2 10-mort hives your boys will be under tomorrow." That caught a couple more ears. "What's that?" a sergeant down the bench asked. Ken turned slightly so he could address the table without looking like he was grandstanding. German Feldwebel confirmed they shifted 2 guns to the rise south of the stream bend. Observation post still on the ridge. They're going to fire in the morning if the weather breaks. He gestured with his spoon toward an imaginary map. "If you stay in that low ground, you're in the beaten zone." The sergeant grunted. "That's our push." "Yeah," Ken said. "I know." The lieutenant's smirk wavered just a hair. The joke had landed on something too solid. He took a swallow from his cup to cover it. "Lot of detail for a fellow who isn't in the line," he said, but the edge was duller. "I read what they write," Ken said, "and I listen when they talk. That's the job." He didn't add, "And I do it for men who have never had barbed wire put around their parents." He kept that where it belonged, on the inside, next to the letter. Around them, the easy mess tent noise started up again. Someone on the far end of the bench started telling a story about a mule that refused to move in the mountains. The cook barked at a private to bring back his tray this time. The small disruption of the lieutenant's jab smoothed out, absorbed by the tense warmth. But something had shifted. Not big, not dramatic, just a recalibration. A couple of men gave Ken quick, appraisal-type looks. Not friendly yet, not sit with us. But this one's useful. In an army, usefulness was a kind of citizenship. The lieutenant toyed with his bread. "You really think they'll shoot in the morning?" he asked, quieter, aimed more at Ken than at the table now. "I don't think," Ken said. "The Feldwebel said. And the dispatch we picked up earlier said the same area was under observation. 2 sources." The lieutenant chewed that, jaw moving. At last he said, grudging, "Then I guess I owe you a drink if we don't get our heads blown off." Ken let himself smile, just a little. "I'll take hot coffee." "That I can manage." The moment could have ended there. A minor victory, a small sanding down of suspicion. But quiet fortitude wasn't just not getting angry. It was putting the conversation back on rails so next time the joke didn't come so easy. So he added, still mild, "For what it's worth, Lieutenant, Tokyo doesn't care about a muddy company on an Italian ridge. Berlin does." A couple of the men snorted. The lieutenant shook his head, but this time it was in amusement, not mockery. "All right, Tanaka. All right." They ate. The stew was lukewarm, but it filled the space in his stomach. Outside, a truck ground gears. Somewhere, artillery thumped. Friendly, distant. The war pressed at the tent walls, invisible but constant. Ken listened to the men talk, baseball, girls, how long until rotation. He didn't have the same reference points. He didn't jump in. But he was at the table, and the lieutenant didn't try the Tokyo line again. When he finished, he stacked his tray and stood. As he turned to go, the sergeant who'd asked about the guns spoke without looking up. "Hey, interpreter?" "Yes, Sergeant." "Good catch on that rise." 4 words, not a speech, not a medal. But in the dark, in 1944, in a foreign country where your family sat behind American wire, 4 words like that were something a man could hold on to. He nodded. "Yes, Sergeant." Outside, the mist had thickened again. He pulled his coat tighter and headed back toward the ops area. Tomorrow morning, if the weather cleared, German guns would reach for Americans. Maybe fewer of them would be there to be hit because he'd stayed calm in a mess tent. Quiet fortitude, he thought, was sometimes as dull as eating stew and choosing the right sentence. The runner brought it in wrapped in a poncho like contraband. "From patrol, sir. Off a dead officer. It's soaked." The ops captain didn't even curse, just looked past him to Ken. "Tanaka. Table." Ken was already moving. The tent flap slapped behind him. Wind shoved damp air inside. On the table, the captain laid out the packet. Thin German field paper, edges curled, ink bled where rain had soaked through. A corner still smelled faintly of river mud and that metallic scent of wet ink. "Patrol says Kraut had a map case, too," the captain said. "But this was on his person. Might be fresh. I need to know if it's about us." "Yes, sir." Ken pulled the lantern closer. Shadows jumped across the canvas, over the nailed-down map, over the captain's tired face. He eased the top sheet flat with his palm. The German handwriting was tight, professional, not a private scrawl. Signal officer, maybe. That helped. Signal officers had habits. Some lines were clear. Batarian 2 U3 Werden, batteries 2 and 3 Will. Then a wash of gray where water had turned words to fog. At the top, a date only a day old. This was current. This mattered. He uncapped his pencil, wrote the clear parts in English on his notebook, line by line, leaving space for the blanks. The captain hovered, arms folded, boots muddy on the ground sheet. "Can you read it?" "Parts, sir. It's written like previous artillery coordination notes. Some of it washed out." "Well, unwash it." Ken didn't smile. "I'll do what I can." He bent over the page, blocking drafts with his shoulders. German staff liked patterns. Specify unit, specify target sector, specify time weather caveat, specify observation. If one piece was gone, he could sometimes rebuild it from the rest. "Werden," he murmured, tracing the faded part with a fingertip. The ink had bled outward, leaving a ghost of letters. "Probably Werden Verlegt. Will be moved. The patrol said the body was found south of our line?" "Right." Then he was on the way between batteries. So 2 and 3 being moved matches what the POW said. The captain grunted. "Good. Keep going." Next line. "Biob, Stel Bleibt. Observation post remains. That matched too. Good. The ghost word after Bleibt was just a vertical smear. But in this kind of report, the word was almost always bestehen or unverandert. He weighed them. Unverandert, unchanged, made more sense with batteries moving, but OP staying. He wrote, observation post remains unchanged. His throat was dry. He reached for the canteen at his belt, took a small sip, eyes never leaving the page. This was the part the other men never saw. Not the translation, but the gamble. Deciding what a dead German officer had meant when rain had half erased him. Here, he said, this will be the target description. The captain leaned in. The line was more damaged, whole words missing. But the structure was the same as the dispatch from earlier. Amerikanische Infanterie südlich der. American infantry south of the. Then nothing but gray. On the map, south of the bend, there was only one landmark, the ruined farmhouse. He looked up at the captain. This is the same sector, he said. The one I told you about. The abandoned farmhouse. They're watching it and preparing to fire on anyone massing there. You're sure? The captain's eyes were sharp now. Not hostile. Checking. He could have said, it's too damaged, sir. We need corroboration. That would be safe. That would also delay a warning. And in the morning, when German guns reached for the valley, we needed corroboration. Wouldn't mean much to the men under shells. He thought of the lieutenant in the mess tent, of the sergeant's good catch, of his mother's blacked-out letter, of how, if he got this wrong, the suspicion that clung to his face would have a reason to stay forever. I'm sure enough to tell them to shift, he said. German reports don't invent landmarks. If he wrote south of the farmhouse, he meant the same bend. The captain studied him a long second, then nodded once. All right, I'll send it. Ken copied the translation cleanly on another page, dated it, put his initials. The paper was cool under his palm. This was the irreversible part, his name tied to a reconstructed line. If someone up the chain questioned how they knew, his notes would show logic, not guesswork. Outside, artillery thumped, distant. The tent canvas bellied in and out with the wind. He added a line at the bottom. Weather dependent, likely delay if rain continues. The German had started to write Wetterab before the ink bled. It was a fair completion. Artillery was always a marriage with weather. He handed the page over. The captain read fast, lips moving. This is good, he said. This keeps them alive. He didn't say thank you. Men rarely did in 1944. But he slid the page into a message wallet with care. When the captain left, Ken stayed a moment, looking at the ghosted German original. Bits of river, bits of war. If that patrol hadn't shot that rider, if the rain had been harder, if the ink had washed just a little more, none of this would be here. No one would know. Americans would walk into a valley watched by 3 Germans on a ridge. He folded the dispatch back into its poncho wrapping. His fingers ached from gripping the pencil. He flexed them, listening to the rain. Quiet fortitude tonight was this, trusting his own reconstruction more than the doubts in the room. The ops tent emptied fast after the captain left with the dispatch. Men had places to be before dark, wire to check, patrols to brief, radios to test. What they left behind was the smell of wet canvas, cooling lamp oil, and maps that didn't quite agree with the land outside. Ken stayed. The German sheets lay off to the side, still damp around the edges, weightless and deadly. On the wall, the American map of this sector was tacked to a board. Grid lines, contour, the looping river, the little square penciled ruined FH for farmhouse. Someone had jabbed thumbtacks where platoons were supposed to be. Supposed to, because men moved, but maps didn't always get told. He pulled the lantern closer, set his notebook beside the map, and began lining things up. German phrasing first. Amerikanische Infanterie, südlich des Hofes, south of the farmhouse. Beobachtung oben. Observation above. Artillerieschlag, wetterabhängig. Weather-dependent artillery strike. Then the coordinates, not exact on the copy because of the wash, but close enough to lay down a box. He traced the river bend with a forefinger. The American map gave it a slightly different curve than the German description, but the essentials matched. River, rise, farmhouse ruins. South of that was where Able Company of the 141st had been operating. He remembered the captain saying it. He remembered the lieutenant's face in the mess tent when the joke had broken on fact. He stepped back, squinted, then leaned in again. Maps in the field were never perfect. Floods moved streams. Shelling flattened landmarks. But the farmhouse, that was fixed. Even knocked down, it was a marker every patrol mentioned. He dug in the message crate and found the day's patrol report. Damp, typed crooked on a field machine. He scanned it. Patrol from Bika reports enemy OP on ridge above ruined farmhouse. 3 men, field glasses, withdrew on fire. 3 men. Same as the Feldwebel had said. So, German OP on ridge. American patrols had seen them. German dispatch confirming observation. German plan to fire on anyone south of that farmhouse. And in that exact place tomorrow, Americans were scheduled to push. He felt the click, the mental one, when puzzle pieces that hate each other still have to touch. It was them, not some faceless unit, not a nameless outfit on the other side of the valley. The very men who had side-eyed him at the tent door. The lieutenant who'd said Tokyo. The sergeant who'd later said good catch. The company that still, on some level, thought of him as an odd presence in their war. He straightened slowly, hands braced on the table. For a moment, he let the uglier thoughts stand. If he said nothing, the Germans would fire, and some of those men would learn, too late, that the Jap interpreter had mattered. The temptation was short, sharp, and human. Then his mind put his mother back behind the wire in California, writing, "We are proud of you." Proud of him for wearing the uniform, not for nursing grudges. He let his jaw unclench. Duty didn't get to choose who benefited from it. He pulled another map, an older one, edges frayed, to check for any alternate interpretation. Maybe the Germans had meant another farmhouse, another bend. Maybe he could tell himself the target was a mile off. But every line he traced brought him back to the same square of Italian earth. Outside, a truck rattled past, voices muffled. Rain had become a fine, steady fall. The tent canvas ticked with it. He turned to the radio log, flipping to the schedule for the morning. Units rotating, supply convoys, artillery fire missions. The company in question was listed to make a limited advance along the river line at first light, conditions permitting. Conditions, he thought, will also permit German guns. He felt his pulse in his throat. This was the part he hated. Not the interrogation, not the translation, but this middle moment between knowing and telling, when it was still technically possible to fold the knowledge down and pretend it wasn't clear. He looked again at the German handwriting, at the neat, sure strokes of an officer who had not doubted the Americans would be there, at the smear where rain had tried to make the war softer and had failed. "All right," he said softly to no one. "It's them." That was the irreversible point, spoken aloud even under his breath, it became a fact he couldn't hide from himself. He gathered up his notes into a tidy sheaf, German original, his English reconstruction, a quick overlay sketch of the map. He wrote at the top, in block letters, Probable target, Co. Able, 131st Inf. U.S., south of ruined farmhouse. Under it, smaller. Info from POW plus captured dispatch pulse patrol report. He made it as airtight as a forward intel note could be. A man who looked like him could not afford fuzzy. As he wrote, he imagined the questions that might come. How did you know? Why did you think it was that unit? Why were you looking at that map? He imagined the slant to those questions, not just procedural, but watchful. He would answer with this paper, with this logic, with this chain. He tucked his mother's letter deeper into his tunic, so it wouldn't get wet. Then he stepped out into the rain. The night was dark the way only blackout war nights were. No village light, no farmhouse window, just the low glow of guarded tents. Mud sucked at his boots. He walked fast toward the command section, notes held under his coat. He could have waited for morning. He didn't. Quiet fortitude wasn't patient in the wrong places. At the staff tent, a corporal on duty looked up, surprised. You need something? I need to see the captain or whoever has the fire plan, Ken said. It's about the German guns. The corporal looked past him at the rain, at the hour, then nodded. I'll get him. As he waited, with water dripping from his helmet brim, Ken felt that odd mix of calm and dread settle over him. Calm, because he knew he was doing the right thing. Dread, because doing the right thing always seemed to end with someone asking him to prove, again, that he belonged in this uniform. The staff tent was half lit, half asleep. A field phone sat on a crate, its line running out under the canvas into the dark. A lieutenant from S3 was bent over a movement chart. Sleeves rolled, eyes ringed. The captain from Ops had his jacket off and was writing up the day's summary. It was the hour when even officers let their shoulders drop. Ken stepped in, rain dripping from his helmet. The warmth hit him, then the smell of coffee gone bitter on the burner. Sir, he said to the captain, I have an update on the German artillery plan. The captain glanced up, pen still in hand. Can it wait until morning, Tanaka? We just sent your translation. No, sir, Ken said, because the target is Able Company, 141st, at the farmhouse sector, and the Germans plan to fire as soon as weather allows. That got the lieutenant's head up. The captain set his pen down. You're certain? The captain said. Not a question, a demand. Yes, sir. POW confirmation, captured dispatch, and today's patrol report all point to the same ridge OP. I overlaid it with our map. It's the unit pushing in the morning. The captain exhaled through his nose, the way men did when war kept refusing to stay on the schedule. Goddamn. S3, did you copy that? The lieutenant was already reaching for the phone. Line's been spotty since the rain, sir. Of course it has, the captain muttered. Ken held out his notes. I wrote it clean. If we can't reach them, we can at least push it to division for broadcast. The captain took the papers, eyes moving fast. He paused at the header, probable target, so able. Then, at the chain of sources Ken had listed. He looked up. You reconstructed some of this? Yes, sir, based on standard phrasing and the landmark match. That means if you're wrong, yes, sir, Ken said. It's on me. He said it without flinching. That was the line he was crossing. Putting his face, his handwriting, his name from a family in a camp, on a decision that could wake up a whole sector. If he was wrong, they'd remember the Jap who cried wolf. If he was right, No one would need to remember anything but the shells that didn't land. The captain studied him a beat longer than usual. There was calculation there, not about whether Germans fired, but about whether an MS Nisei could be allowed to be this decisive. Then the captain nodded. Fine, we warn them. He turned to the lieutenant. Try the battalion net. If you can't get them, go up to regiment. Mark it priority. German artillery on our forward company. Yes, sir. The lieutenant lifted the handset, cranked, listened. Faint static, a voice answering thin. Battalion, this is 3. Priority message. Artillery warning for Able Company. While the lieutenant wrestled with the line, the captain looked back at Ken. How did you pinpoint it so fast? Because the Germans described the same observation post our patrol saw today, sir, Ken said. 3 men on the ridge above the ruined farmhouse. That's not a common combination. And the gun shift the POW mentioned matches the dispatch. You're saying you combined human intel and captured Doc in an hour? Yes, sir. Good, the captain said. That's why you're up here and not back at Naples. He said it matter of fact. Not praise, just a statement of why he was being allowed to exist in this space. The lieutenant swore under his breath. Sir, they're getting me, but it's weak. I can pass it to regimental and let them broadcast down. Do it. The lieutenant relayed, speaking slowly, spelling out the grid. Ken listened to the coordinates spoken aloud. The farmhouse, the bend, the ridge. Each number was like a nail fixing his reconstruction into reality. Once sent, it was real. When the lieutenant hung up, he shook his head. No guarantee it got all the way, sir. It got far enough, the captain said. He turned back to Ken. This better be right. It is, sir. Then go get some sleep. That was dismissal, but not unfriendly. Ken nodded. Yes, sir. He turned to go, then stopped. The question he hated was waiting. He asked it anyway, because if someone else brought it up later, it would sting more. Sir, do you need to log that I initiated? He said. Because of my... He didn't say face, blood, camp. He let the captain fill the blank. The captain looked at him for a long second. Something like irritation at the world flickering across his features. I need to log that a forward MICE interpreter corroborated a captured German doc with POW interrogation. That's all. Yes, sir. Get out of here. Outside, the rain had eased to a drizzle. The camp was muffled, lights low. Ken stood under the eave a moment, letting the cool air hit his face. There. Done. He had spoken. He had cut through the lateness, the hierarchy, the possibility of being swatted down. Now, if in the morning the guns fired and the Americans were already moving back 20 yards, he would know he had a hand in that. And if someone came around later asking why he was so eager to move white infantry out of harm's way, he had the paper to show. He walked back toward his tent, boots whispering in the mud. The letter from his mother sat against his chest, warm now from his body. He thought of her. We are proud of you, written under American wire. This, he thought, is what you meant. Sleep didn't come. He lay on his cot with his boots still on, coat over him, helmet at the foot like a loyal dog, listening to the rain tick and the far-off cough of engines. The canvas above him glowed faintly from a lamp outside. Every now and then, he heard a phone crank in the staff tent, a murmur, the thunk of the receiver. Messages were moving. He didn't know if his message was one of them. What if the line died after regiment? What if the wording was garbled? Farmhouse sector could become farm sector, and there were too many farms in Italy. What if the lieutenant on the other end had been half asleep and wrote the wrong grid? He turned on his side, staring at the tent wall. The German officer who'd written that dispatch hadn't doubted the Americans would be there. Germans rarely doubted their own artillery. That certainty sat like a weight on Ken's chest. Enough. He swung his legs off the cot, grabbed his notebook and helmet, and stepped back into the night. The rain had thinned to a mist that caught the light from the ops tent and turned it into halos. Mud sucked at his soles. The camp was a line of subdued glows, voices low, men conserving themselves for another wet day. In the staff tent, the lieutenant was rubbing his eyes and looking at a damp blotter. The phone sat quiet now. "Sir," Ken said softly from the entrance. "Did we get confirmation they received?" The lieutenant looked up, blinking. "We passed to regiment. That's as far as we can push from here." "Yes, sir," Ken said. "But I can try the artillery support net. They usually keep a cleaner line. If they broadcast sector warning, it'll blanket everyone." The lieutenant frowned, not angry, just tired. "We already sent it, Tanaka." "I know, sir," Ken said. "But the Germans will fire when the weather breaks. They were specific. If the first message died, we won't know until they start pulling bodies out." It wasn't defiance. It was simple math. And it was said without heat, just fact. That was his shield. The lieutenant hesitated, then shrugged in a way that said, "If you want to stay up and fight the radios, go ahead." "Fine. Don't tie up the line if regiment calls back." "Yes, sir." The radio shack was a smaller tent off to the side. Canvas stretched tight to keep out as much damp as possible. Inside, the air smelled of hot tubes and wet wool. A corporal with headphones around his neck looked up when Ken ducked in. "Just close down, Mass," the corporal said. "Rain's making everything ugly." "I know. I need to put through a short warning on the support net. Artillery." The corporal eyed him. "You got clearance?" Ken held up the ops captain's scrawl from earlier, not written for this, but close enough. "Priority German arty info, Tanaka." The corporal read, nodded. War was built on scraps of paper like that. "Keep it short," the corporal said, sliding the headphones over. "Net's jumpy." Ken sat, tugged the set toward him. The bakelight was cold under his fingers. He adjusted the dials by habit, listening for the cleaner signal. Not perfect, never perfect, but less mush. Static hissed, then a voice in English, faint and formal, somewhere up the chain. He waited for a break and keyed. "Support. This is forward MIS interpreter attached to 141st Sector," he said. Voice clipped, professional. "German captured dock and POW intel, confirm probable artillery on Farmhouse Bend sector at first weather break. Recommend units south of Bend stand off 20 to 30 yards. Repeat." Static chewed the tail of his repeat. He keyed again and sent the grid in slow, careful numbers. He added the phrase, "German OP confirmed on Ridge," because sometimes that convinced nervous staffers that this was real, not imagination. When he released the key, he listened hard. Nothing. He exchanged a look with the corporal. The corporal lifted one shoulder. "Could have gone through. Could have bounced." "Can we get acknowledgement?" "Not tonight. You know how it is with the weather." Ken sat back. He could feel his own pulse in his ears. This was the part of war no one filmed. A man talking into a crackling box in a wet tent, sending a warning he might never know was heard. He jotted the time and wording in his notebook. If someone ever asked, there would be a line. 2357 HRs, artillery warning retransmitted via support net. "Thanks," he said to the corporal. "Hope it helps us and not them," the corporal said, meaning the Germans. "It will help us," Ken said, though he couldn't prove it. Outside again, the night felt thinner, like dawn was somewhere behind the clouds. He looked toward the dark shape of the hills where the company would be moving. Men were probably asleep up there, helmets hanging off cots, boots lined in a row, trusting that the people down here would keep guns off their heads. He drew a slow breath. The doubt didn't disappear, but it settled. He had done the part he could control. He'd pushed past the point where an ordinary interpreter would have said, "I passed it up, it's their problem." Quiet fortitude, he thought, is pushing the message twice. He went back to his tent, lay down again without undressing. This time, when sleep came, it came not because he was unworried, but because he had exhausted every line available to him. The gun started not with a single boom, but with a distant, testing thud, like someone tapping on the door of the valley. Dawn hadn't fully come. The sky was a wet gray sheet. The camp was already stirring, men shrugging into coats, trucks coughing. Then the second round came, closer, and everyone knew it wasn't friendly. Ken was by the radio tent when the third one landed. The ground shook, a dull, belly-deep concussion rolling down from the direction of the river bend. Someone swore. An MP ducked instinctively, hand on helmet. The corporal with the headphones snapped his head toward the set as if he could see the shell through the wire. "German guns," the corporal said, pointless to say but human to name. Ken stepped inside, out of the drizzle. The air in the little tent was tense and hot. The set crackled with half-formed words from other posts, locations, confirmations, the usual morning chaos when the enemy decided to set the tempo. He listened for the sector he'd warned. Another shell came in, farther this time, walking the line. He tried to map it in his head. OP on the ridge, guns on the southern rise, target south of the farmhouse. If Able Company had stayed put, they'd be in the pattern right now, heads down in the cold Italian mud, wondering why no one had told them. He gripped the side of the table until his knuckles went pale. This was the worst part. Impact without information. He could hear the guns, but not the consequence. "Any traffic from 141st forward?" he asked. "Give it a minute," the corporal said, fiddling with the gain. "Everybody's talking at once." Outside, another set of thuds rolled over them, slightly off from the first. Different tubes, different battery. The Germans were feeling for them. Weather had cleared just enough, exactly like the dispatch said. "If they die," a voice in him said, "it's because the line died after regiment. Because you knew, and you couldn't drag the wire all the way up the hill yourself." He shut it down. Useless thought. The radio squealed and then stabilized. A thin, strained voice came through, American, breathless with having to talk under fire. "This is Able. Farmhouse sector taking indirect. We pulled off bend, casualties light so far." Ken's head snapped toward the set. "Say again," the corporal said quickly, leaning in. "Pulled off bend," the voice repeated clearer. "Good thing someone told us last night. OP still on ridge, requesting counter battery. Good thing someone told us last night." He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It left him shaky. His shoulders sagged for half a second before he straightened again. They'd moved. Maybe not far. Maybe only those 20, 30 yards, he'd said in the dark. But far enough that the first bracketing shells were mostly throwing dirt. Outside, more impacts. Closer to where the Jemont company would have been, not where it was. The corporal grinned, brief and fierce. "They got it." "Yeah," Ken said, voice low. "They got it." The radio passed the request up. Artillery, counter battery, spotting, the bigger machinery of war woke up in response. To them, it was just another morning barrage, another adjustment. To him, it was the answer to the question that had kept him from sleeping. He stepped back out into the gray. The air smelled of wet earth and distant cordite, even though the guns were a valley away. Men were standing, listening. One asked, "Ours?" "Ours are answering," someone said. Krauts started it. Ken tilted his head, listening to the rhythm. The German rounds were steady but not perfect. They were firing at where they believed Americans would be, not exactly where Americans were. A small difference, bought in the middle of the night by a second radio push. No one came over to clap him on the shoulder. No one called out, "Hey, Tanaka, that was your intel." The ops captain jogged past with his helmet on, heading for the main tent, giving Ken only a quick, distracted nod. He had reports to file, guns to coordinate, men to keep moving. That was right. That was how it worked. Ken looked toward the hills anyway, toward the place on the map that had become too familiar. He pictured the lieutenant from the mess tent, helmet low, shouting men back off the bend because someone at HQ said so. He pictured them dropping into better cover just before the first round came in. "Good," he murmured to the rain. He went back inside the radio tent long enough to note the time of the Able Company transmission. Vota 613 HRs. Able reports pulled off bend thanks to warning. He underlined thanks to warning once. Not to brag, there was no audience, but to capture truth before the day buried it. Then he closed the notebook. Quiet fortitude this morning was accepting that the best proof he'd done right was the absence of American bodies on a bend in Italy that had no name he'd remember in 10 years. By mid-morning, the rain had settled into a gray drizzle, and the German guns had gone quiet, either satisfied or outgunned. Trucks rattled. Men talked about the barrage the way they talked about weather. Wasn't so bad. Could have been worse. Lucky we weren't on the bend. Luck. That was what they would call a warning pushed through 2 nets in the middle of the night. For Ken, the day should have been done. He had proof of effect. He had written the time in his notebook. He had, for once, something close to relief. That was when the stranger came. He wasn't from their battalion. His coat was drier, his boots cleaner, his eyes sharper in the way of men who worked with papers more than mud. He wore the insignia of a higher staff, division maybe. He ducked into the ops tent without waiting to be waved in, nodding, only briefly, at the captain. "Morning," he said. "I'm looking for the MIS interpreter who originated the artillery warning last night." That would be me should have been a proud sentence. Ken felt his shoulders tighten instead. "I'm Tanaka," he said. The officer turned, eyes going straight to his face, registering, filing. "All right, Tanaka. I need to see your source material." The Oppie's captain glanced between them. "We already sent the warning," he said. "It was good. Saved Abel's boys a beating." "I read the report," the newcomer said, unbothered. It said, "Reconstructed from captured German doc plus POW interrogation." "That's not standard. I want to see how he reconstructed it." "Not standard." The phrase sat like a stone. Ken kept his voice level. "I have the German original here, sir," he said, "and my English reconstruction dated. Also the patrol report I used to confirm the Ridge OP." "Good," the officer said. "Let's see it." They moved to the table. The lamp hissed softly. Outside, someone laughed at something near the mess line. Inside, the air narrowed. Ken laid out the papers in order. German damp original on the left, his handwritten English on the right, patrol report above, quick map sketch below. He lined them neatly. His handwriting was tidy, squared off, the way MIS had drilled. He always dated and initialed. He was suddenly grateful for every extra line he'd written in the night. The officer bent over the German sheet, "This is water damaged," he said. "Yes, sir. Patrol recovered it off a dead officer." "And you filled in south of farmhouse here?" "Yes, sir. Because the officer had already written Amerikanische Infanterie südlich des, and the only marked landmark south of their OP in our sector is the ruined farmhouse. German staff reports in this area have been consistent about using it." The officer's eyes moved to the patrol report. "Your patrol saw the OP with 3 men?" "Yes, sir." "Which matched the POW interrogation, same day. Feldwebel confirmed 2 10.5s moved and OP remaining." "So you combined human source, captured Doc, and patrol at night, in the rain?" There was no admiration in his tone, just enumeration. "Yes, sir." The officer straightened a little, fixing Ken with that bland official look. "You understand why I'm here?" "Because I initiated the warning, sir." "Because an interpreter, who is forward attached, who is not an S2 officer, pushed an artillery warning that moved an entire company off its objective. And because the document was damaged, Division likes to know when we act on inferences. There it was. Because you look like this. Because your family is in a camp. Because whenever you're decisive, we have to double-check." Ken could feel the pulse in his throat again, the same one from the night. He kept his hands flat on the table so they wouldn't curl. "Yes, sir," he said. "That's why I have the chain written." The officer tapped the corner of the German sheet. "What if this smear was not south of farmhouse, but south of forward line? Which would be broader?" he said. "What if your whole house of cards rests on one assumption?" Ken didn't let the offense show. "Then, sir, the patrol report still confirmed the OP on the ridge above the farmhouse, and the POW still confirmed 2 pieces moved to that sector, and the time of the German plan still matched their typical morning window after weather. 3 different sources pointing to the same place." The officer watched him. "You're confident." "I was confident enough to wake your people," Ken said. Then, softer, because edge wouldn't help. "And this morning's fire pattern matched the German plan. Able Company reported pulling back because of the warning, so the inference was correct." The officer's jaw moved. He looked toward the captain. "Able confirm that?" The captain, who had been listening with growing impatience, said, "They did. Casualties light. They said, and I quote, 'Good thing someone told us last night.'" Then he added, in a tone that said, "This dog can hunt," that someone was him. The officer let out a breath through his nose. Some of the tension bled from his shoulders. He looked back at the papers, at the neat English, at the dated notebook. "All right," he said. "I'll note that the inference was supported by multiple sources." He picked up the German original carefully and handed it back. "Keep doing it like this," he said. "Chain it, date it. If you fill in a gap, write why. Command will back you if you can show your work." "Yes, sir." The officer was already turning to go. At the tent flap, he paused. "And Tanaka?" "Yes, sir." "Good catch." He said it like it cost him nothing. Then he left, boots thudding on wet earth. The captain looked at Ken. "Don't take it personal," he said. "Division gets squirrely when non-S2s make calls. You did right." "I know, sir," Ken said. And he did know. On paper, in doctrine, in the rational part of his mind. The sting was somewhere else, in the place that remembered his mother's letter under censor ink. He gathered his papers back into order. German on top, his English beneath. He slid them into the map case, each edge aligned. If being exact was the price of being believed, he would be exact. Outside, the drizzle went on. Men lined up for their midday ration. talking about the barrage as if it had just happened to miss them. None of them knew that for a few minutes, a man who wasn't sure they trusted him had had to convince another man that he'd kept them alive. Quiet fortitude this time was refusing to let that sour the win. The Opprelder mail came in the afternoon this time, slung in a damp bag off the back of a truck that smelled of gasoline and river mud. Men called out for their names, hungry for handwriting. After the morning barrage, the camp had settled into that jumpy quiet. The kind where everyone pretended it was a normal day. Mail helped the pretending. "Tanaka!" the clerk called, voice flat. Ken turned from the ops tent. "Here." The envelope was like the last one. Thin, edges softened by too many hands, postmark weeks behind them. Same return address, the camp. Same neat Japanese hand. But this one had a faint smear across the corner, as if whoever handled it had had wet fingers. A bad omen, if a man believed in those. "Thanks," he said. He didn't open it there. Too many eyes, too bright, even in gray Italy. He walked past the stacked fuel cans, past the radio tent, to the lee of a supply truck where canvas and metal made a small, private angle. Wind snapped the main tent canvas nearby. The day smelled of mud, exhaust, and boiled rations. He slid a thumb under the flap. The paper inside was stiffer, cheaper. He unfolded it carefully. His mother's handwriting was there, but this time whole lines were boxed out, not just brushed over. Thick, black rectangles. The censors had been busier. "Dearest Kenji," it began as always. "We were black to receive your last letter. We know you are doing very important work for the United States." He read on. "We have been told that we will be transferred." The verb was half covered, but clear enough in context. "To another place." Name of place, completely blacked. "Father says it is farther, colder." Those words hadn't been cut. Someone in the office hadn't thought colder was dangerous. Relocated. Farther, colder. He felt the ground narrow under him. An artillery barrage was easy to understand. The enemy fired, you moved, you lived. This was worse in a way. He warned countrymen in Italy and saved their skin, and in return, the country quietly moved his parents deeper in. He went back to the top, as if he'd misread. "We have been told." No, he hadn't misread. Wind pushed at the truck canvas. The metal was cold against his shoulder. He bent over the letter to keep the drizzle off, as if the rain could make it worse. His mother tried to make it sound small. "It is only that there is more work there," she wrote. "Your father says he can still do it. Your sister is sad because she began to like the school here. But we will endure. You must also endure. We are proud." Proud. Again, written under a system that had decided to move them like freight. His jaw clenched. He could see them, not as a blur, but the small, stubborn specifics. His father's careful folding of shirts even when there was nowhere to go. His mother writing under a weak bulb in a shared barracks. His sister who drew barbed wire in the corner of letters because she was too young not to, now told to pack again. He imagined the train, the barracks, somewhere drier, harsher. Imagined, too, the casual way someone in an office had stamped the order, not thinking about a son in Italy in MIS greens. His fingers tightened on the paper. It crackled. For a second, he saw himself tearing it in half, jagged, satisfying, and throwing it into the Italian mud. If he didn't read it, if he didn't keep it, then the relocation didn't exist. If he didn't carry it, he didn't have to hold the insult alongside the uniform. But tearing it wouldn't move them back. It would just make him the man who couldn't hold his mother's words. He let out a slow breath through his nose. The cold air stung. He loosened his grip, smoothing the wrinkles with his palm. A shadow fell over the page. The ops captain was walking past toward the radio shack, helmet under his arm. He glanced over. Mail again? Yes, sir. Good. Keep the men writing. Keeps them sane. He moved on without waiting for an answer. Keep the men writing. As if the letters were all the same. As if some weren't from behind American wire. Ken folded the sheet along its creases. The censor had left one final line untouched, either out of kindness or haste. Do not worry for us. Do your work well. That will bring us home faster. He almost laughed, a short, humorless sound swallowed by the wind. Do your work well. He had done it so well last night that white infantry had woken up alive. And his family, who had applauded this service, had been told to move to a colder place. This was the all is lost part. He could feel it. The moment when cause and cost stopped matching. When the war stopped being transaction, you serve, you belong, and became a test. You serve even when belonging is pulled away. He stood there a long moment, letter in both hands, letting the anger run through and past him. If he took it into the ops tent like this, it would flavor everything, every translation, every answer. He would start hearing insult where there was none. He would start thinking, let the shells fall. He couldn't afford it. He refolded the letter with care, as if it were fragile, slid it into the same pocket as the first. 2 thin weights now, not one. The choice to keep it was the irreversible turn. He was choosing to remember the move to the harsher camp, not to erase it. Choosing to let it hurt and still translate German for officers who might never see the hurt. Back in the tent, the radio was carrying routine traffic again. Patrol reports, supply notes, some artillery adjustment. War unchanged by his private blow. He sat at the table, opened his notebook, and wrote a single line at the top of a blank page. Family relocated to colder camp. They say to endure. No elaboration, no complaint, just fact. Then he turned the page and went back to German terms for supply dumps. Quiet fortitude today was this, serving the same country that was making his family's winter longer. They rolled in just before dusk, low, wet light, engines muted, men in the same olive drab as everyone else, but faces like his. Trucks with canvas tops streaked by road grime, rifle muzzles jutting, boots already muddy from where they'd been. 442nd Regimental Combat Team, or a piece of it, moving up to where someone needed a unit that did not break. The camp changed tone when they arrived. Not hostile, not even wary, just watching. Most of the white GIs had heard of the Go for Broke Boys, the Japanese-American outfit that fought like men trying to earn back something. Seeing them in the flesh made the contradiction louder. American uniforms on Japanese faces, while someplace in the States, barbed wire was going up. Ken stood near the ops tent with a clipboard, pretending to be checking a list. Really, he was looking. Their helmets sat the same way on their heads as his. Their eyes flicked the same way over the terrain, noting cover, mud, truck spacing. Their coats were darker with rain in the same pattern. They smelled of wool, oil, and road, his smell. A staff sergeant from the 442nd jumped down from the first truck, landing light for a man carrying that much kit. He looked around for whoever was in charge. The ops captain walked over to greet him. They traded fast, functional information, road conditions, billets, chow. While they talked, the sergeant's eyes slid once over Ken and paused. Just a fraction of a second longer than a white soldier's would. Recognition, like a nod across a crowded room. When the captain finished and headed back, the sergeant veered toward Ken. You miss? He said, voice quiet, West Coast under the Army cadence. Yes, Ken said. Forward attached. The sergeant's mouth flickered. Figures. Heard there was one up here making S2 nervous. So division had talked. Word traveled faster than trucks. Ken tried to keep it light. Just trying to keep our guys from getting shelled. That why Able Company was off the bend this morning? Ken didn't answer right away. The sergeant didn't press. He shifted his rifle sling higher, glancing toward the mud road where the rest of his unit was parking. They don't have to know it was you, the sergeant said, almost offhand. The words landed harder than any praise. Ken swallowed. Doesn't it bother you? He said. Doing it and watching it get briefed without your name? The sergeant huffed through his nose. Bothers everybody, he said. But we're Nisei and 44. We get to choose one thing at a time. We can choose to fight, or we can choose to be thanked. Not always both, nay? There was no biter edge in it, just tired knowledge. My family just got moved, Ken said before he could stop himself. The words came out low, for this man's ears only. To a colder camp, after all this. The sergeant's eyes didn't widen. He just nodded once, slow, like a man ticking off something he'd expected to hear sooner or later. Mine been in since 42, he said. Topaz. Before I shipped out, my old man said, you go, we stay, we all show them. He jerked his chin toward the ops tent. You showed them this morning. They're still moving them, Ken said. Farther in. Yeah, the sergeant said. They're still moving them. We're still fighting. We keep putting weight on our side of the scale till it tips. That's the game. Ken looked down at his hands. Ink still stained one thumb from writing the note about colder camp. He suddenly saw that line not as a private insult, but as one tile in a bigger pattern, the one where men with his face fought anyway. The sergeant looked him over, taking in the notebook, the MI insignia, the tired around the eyes. You doing good work, he said. Division doesn't get to push a rifle company 20 yards back in the dark because of a hunch. Someone had to stick his neck out. They came to check it, Ken said. Of course they did, the sergeant said, like he was saying of course it rained in Italy. You got Japanese eyes. You're making white outfits move. Somebody up top is going to say, how he know? That's just how it is, Tanaka. He said the name cleanly, like he'd said that kind before. They accepted it, Ken said, after I showed the chain. Then you live to do it again, the sergeant said. That's the win. Trucks kept arriving. Men from the 432nd were already joking among themselves. English, Japanese, even some Hawaiian cadences. One of them waved the sergeant over. He hesitated. Listen, he said, dropping his voice a little. Out here, nobody's gonna hang an attaboy on you every time you save their necks. They're too busy staying alive. So you keep your own count. You write it down. You remember. Your family's letter said, do your work? Ken blinked. How did you? The sergeant smiled, small. They all say that, he said. My ma said the same thing. Do your work. It's how they fight from in there. From in there, behind the wire. Your folks will hear, the sergeant added. Not from division, not from some general. From us, from guys who come back through. We talk. We tell them there was a M-ICE in Italy pushing warnings. That's how they'll know. That hit someplace deeper than praise from a captain. The idea of word traveling backward, through Nisei channels, to barracks in the desert or mountains. Your boy saved some men in Italy. Felt like a rope thrown over distance. Arigato, Ken said quietly. The sergeant's eyes softened. Ganbata, he said, Hang on, do your best. Then, in English again, brisk, back to Army. We're up near the line tomorrow. If you hear Kraut chattering about us, yell loud. I will. The sergeant trotted back to his men. They were already unloading kit, moving like a unit that had done this too often. Everything in order, weapons dry, boots in step. No one in the camp cheered them, no brass band. Just more mud, more gray sky, more work. Ken watched them a moment longer. Then he looked down at his notebook. On the page with family relocated to colder camp, he added a second line. 432nd passing through, said they will tell. He closed the book. Quiet fortitude didn't have to be solitary. Sometimes it walked into camp, muddy and armed, and reminded you what kind of war you were really fighting. They brought this one in with his wrists tied tighter than usual. He was younger than the Feldwebel, but not green. Lines of fatigue at the corners of the eyes. Uniform worn in the way of men who've been in retreat too long. Mud up his shins, a scrape on his cheek where he'd gone down. He looked around the interrogation tent quickly, as if measuring exits. When his gaze landed on Ken, it stuck. The MP pulled the chair out. The German sat back straight, chin up. He didn't look beaten, he looked offended. The ops captain handed Ken the folder. He's from a supply element tied to the batteries that hit us. If he knows ammo levels or where they're pulling back to, we want it. Yes, sir. The captain left. MP stayed. Ken set his notebook down, pencil ready. The tent smelled of drying canvas and the faint tang of disinfectant someone had splashed on the table earlier. Rain ticked on the roof, always rain, always ticking. He began in English, as procedure. You are a prisoner of war. You will be treated according to... The German cut him off in German, eyes narrowed. You're not American. It was said flat, like a fact. Ken didn't react. Name, rank, unit, he said in German. The German leaned back, studying him. You're Japanese, he said, but you wear their uniform. His mouth curled. Sie lassen euch sogar unsere Sprache sprechen? They even let you speak our language. The MPs looked at Ken, unsure if they should step in. Ken gave the smallest shake of his head. He kept his gaze on the POW. Name, rank, unit, he repeated, same tone. The German smiled, not friendly, but pleased with himself. Gefreiter Otto Weiss, Versorgungszug, he said. Supply platoon. Then, still in German, why do you fight for them? They put your people in camps. We heard it on the radio. There it was. The knife, aimed not at the U.S. Army, but at Tanaka. Ken's jaw wanted to tighten. He let the impulse roll through and out. The letter in his pocket felt suddenly heavier, like the German's words had found it. He wrote the eyes down, name and unit down. Neat. Which battery are you supplying, Gefreiter Weiss? Weiss shrugged. We move where they tell us. North, south, always away from you Americans. Which caliber? Weiss smiled again, lazy. Why should I tell a man whose own country locks up his family? One of the MPs swore softly. Smart-ass Kraut. Ken ignored him. He kept his eyes on Weiss. Because if you tell me, we can arrange to take your wounded if they are left behind, he said in German. And because you are out of the war. They are not. Every round you don't feed them is a round that doesn't fall on your friends. Weiss tipped his head, acknowledging the logic. But he wasn't done probing. Do they trust you? He asked. These Americans? Or do they ask you to show your papers every day? They trust my translations, Ken said, which is all I need. Weiss's eyes glittered. But they will never call you American, he said. So why? Which caliber? Ken said, cutting across him cleanly, tone sharpening. He let just enough command into it to remind Weiss who was tied and who wasn't. 10, 5, or 15. Weiss sat with that. He had aimed his barb, watched it fail to stick. Now he had to decide whether to keep playing or to trade. At length, he sighed, as if this was all very tiresome. 10 to 5, he said. But we are low. Munition kommt langsam. Ammunition comes slowly. Road's bad. New bomb. How low? Weiss lifted one shoulder. 2 days if we fire like today. That was something. Ken wrote it. Where's your fallback position when you run low? Ken asked. Weiss hesitated. Then with a small sour smile he said, farther north in the hills. We have a depot near a church. He gave the village name, half swallowed by his accent. Ken repeated it, anglicizing the vowels so the ops captain would recognize it. Then he asked casually, and your observation post? Still on the ridge above the farmhouse? Weiss snapped his gaze up. You already knew that? He said. Yes, Ken said. I wanted to see if you would confirm. Weiss's mouth thinned. You're very proud, he said, for someone whose mother is in a camp. It was a guess, but it was a good one. The stab landed closer. Ken felt heat rise behind his ears. He pictured the supply truck in Italy, the black bars on the letter, the sergeant from 402nd saying, they don't have to know. This German, who had never seen California, was trying to weaponize what his own government had done to him. He chose, deliberately, not to let the Germans see it work. We treat prisoners according to the conventions, he said back in German, voice flat. You will be moved south. If you want your officers to know you cooperated, I can note it. If not, you can go hungry while we find the same information from someone else. That shifted the balance. Weiss's eyes flicked to the MPs, to the tent flap, to the gray outside. Cooperation, noted, might make things smoother. There is also a second dump, Weiss said grudgingly. He described it, smaller, disguised near a stone wall, meant to feed the OP specifically. He gave traffic times. He confirmed the timing of the morning shoots. Immer morgens, wenn die Amerikaner noch nicht ganz wach sind. Always in the morning, when the Americans are not fully awake. Ken wrote it all down. When he finished, he dated the page and signed his initials. Then, only then, he met Weiss's eyes. You were right about one thing, he said in German. They do ask me to show my work, so I do. Every time. Weiss looked away first. The ops captain came back in. You get anything? Yes, sir, Ken said, switching to English. Ammunition low, 10 perhaps, 2 days at current rate. Fallback depot near. He gave the village name. And a smaller dump feeding the ridge OP. The captain's eyebrows went up. That's useful. Good. He took the notes, already turning away to turn intel into orders. He didn't ask if the POW had said anything personal. That wasn't the war he was fighting. When the MPs led Weiss out, the German glanced back once, curiosity in his eyes, as if he still couldn't quite square a Japanese face, an American uniform, and flawless German. Ken let out a breath. His hands were steady. The taunt was still in his chest like a splinter, but it hadn't touched the work. Quiet fortitude today was refusing to let the enemy define how American he was. The briefing tent was fuller than usual. Maps unrolled, acetate overlays pinned at the corners, grease pencils laid in a row. Cigarette smoke curled under the ridge of the canvas. It was the kind of gathering where platoon leaders stood in back and staff officers stood in front, and everyone pretended there was order in a muddy war. Ken slipped in at the side, notebook under his arm. Interpreters weren't always needed at these, but the ops captain had told him, "Sit in. You should hear what they do with the stuff you pull. So he came, stood against a pole, drips of condensed moisture pattering down near his shoulder. At the front, a major he hadn't seen before tapped the map with his pencil. Morning, German fire confirmed what Intel reported last night. He said, observation on the ridge, 2 10.5s on the southern rise, firing on the bend. Our forward company avoided the worst of it because word got to them in time. Heads nodded. Someone murmured, lucky. Intel obtained from captured enemy document and interrogation. The major went on, smooth. Good work from the forward elements. That was it. No name, no Tanaka. Just Intel obtained. Ken felt the small, stupid ache anyway. He tamped it down. This was how it was supposed to sound. Clean, impersonal, like the information had simply materialized from the ether of war. Names complicated things. Names made someone responsible, and responsible men had to be vetted, and vetted men with Japanese faces meant more questions. Better for them to say, Intel obtained. The major kept talking. We're going to exploit while we know their ammo is low. Prisoner states they have about 2 days at current rate. That gives us a window. Tap, tap on the map. We push here, force them to burn rounds, then bring our guns to bear on their depots. He circled the village name the German had given in interrogation. That was Ken's line. Word for word. He wrote nothing. He just watched the circle appear in grease pencil where it had first appeared in his notebook in neat English under German words, and behind that, in the POW's grudging German. Information moving through layers, losing fingerprints. A lieutenant near the back, not the one from the mess tent, another, raised a hand. Sir, how solid is that depot info? Corroborated by interrogation, the major said. We'll confirm with patrol, but it's solid enough to factor. Then, over his shoulder, almost as an afterthought, interpreter up front did the work last night. Every head didn't turn, but a few did, eyes sliding over to where Ken stood. It wasn't applause. It was more like, oh, that's where the words came from. Then they turned back to the map. That should have been enough. It was, by Army standards. But inside, where the letters from the camps sat, where the German had said, they put your people in camps, there was still a bruise. He imagined, absurdly, what it would be like to hear the major say, Tanaka's work kept Able Company alive. How it would feel to have that spoken in front of men who still half suspected. He let the thought go. Recognition was a luxury, and luxury didn't live in wet tents in Italy. The major finished laying out the plan. Patrols would recon the village. Artillery would register on the ridge. The 402nd element would move through if needed. Each piece was built on information Ken had squeezed out of Germans who thought they could unbalance him by mentioning California. The officers talked as if intel was a natural resource the Army had tapped. When it was over, men filed out, talking about trucks, ammo, weather. The ops captain paused by him. You got what you needed? Yes, sir. Good. You see how it runs? We feed, they move. I saw. The captain studied him a second. Maybe he saw the faint tightness around Ken's eyes. Don't chase credit in this line of work, Tanaka, he said. Low, so only Ken heard. You'll die thirsty. You want credit? Go be infantry. They get medals you can see. We get to know we were right. Ken nodded. Understood, sir. Besides, the captain added, almost wry, your people in the camps will hear. They make their own lists. Ken thought of the 422nd Sergeant's promise. We talk, we tell. That, put next to the major's intel obtained, made something balanced. Out there in the wire and the dust, the right name would be attached. He stepped out of the tent. The air was cold, damp. Trucks were warming engines. Far off, the hills were a smear of green-gray. Somewhere beyond them, Germans were reloading guns he had just put on an American map. Quiet fortitude, in this moment, was accepting that a grease pencil circle on canvas was his applause. Evening settled over the bivouac in thin layers, engines cooling, boots scraping mud off on boards, low talk from men eating. The day's briefing had gone. The map had been rolled. Officers had ducked back to their tents to write reports no one in Ohio would ever read. The rain, for once, had stopped. Everything smelled of wet earth and canvas slowly drying. Ken walked to the radio tent with his notebook under his arm. The corporal was there, headset on, listening to dull traffic. He looked up when Ken came in. "Got something?" "Short one," Ken said. "Follow up on German supply point and OP strength." The corporal nodded, pushed the set toward him. The tubes glowed amber, warming the little space. Outside, a truck backfired, making someone curse. Inside, it was just them and the hiss. Ken sat, flipped his notebook open to a clean page, then back to the earlier page where he'd written the POW's details. He'd already turned it into English. Now he needed to make it travel. Not heroic, not urgent, just necessary. He adjusted the dial until the static smoothed. The line wasn't perfect, it never was. But it would carry sense. He keyed. "Forward MIS interpreter, 141st sector transmitting," he said, voice calm, clipped. "German POW confirms artillery ammunition low, 2 days at current rate. Confirms smaller supply dump feeding OP on ridge above Farmhouse Bend. Confirms OP strength 3 men. Recommend continued harassment of dump and possible night patrol to force relocation of OP." Message ends. He released the key and listened. Static. Then, faint, the acknowledgement. Message received. No name. No, thanks, Tanaka. Just message received. It was enough. In this war, acknowledgement was proof you existed. He logged the time, 1939 furs. He wrote the wording exactly. He initialed. He closed the notebook with a soft thump. Outside, the sky over Italy was the kind of gray that swallowed stars. Men smoked in small groups, hands cupped, faces turned from the breeze. Somewhere to the north, Germans were doing the same thing. Lighting cigarettes, checking guns, reading their own orders. Somewhere far to the east, in a camp with barbed wire and watchtowers, his mother might be finishing another letter under a weak bulb, telling him to do your work. He stood in the doorway of the tent for a moment, letting the cool air hit his face. The 442nd trucks were silhouettes now, parked and quiet. He imagined one of them, on the way back someday, stopping near a camp fence in America, telling a woman in a plain coat, "Your son was in Italy. He warned a company. He was good." No division briefing would ever say it that way. But it would be said. He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had held German papers and American letters, that had pressed a radio key in the dark, that had refused to tear a page even when it hurt. They were steady. This was the shape of his war. Not medals, not cheering, not even a name in a briefing. Just a man in a wet tent in 1944, making sure tomorrow's Americans didn't walk under a German gun. He turned back to the corporal. "Line's all yours." "Thanks," the corporal said, already adjusting the dial. Ken stepped out into the evening. Canvas snapped softly. Somewhere, artillery thudded far off. Someone else's problem tonight. He pulled his coat tighter, felt the 2 letters in his pocket, thin and insistent. He kept walking toward his tent.